Okay, cool. It looks like we're live. I see that we do have some people in the chat. So I'm going to do something I have not yet done before and just ask, can you actually hear me? If you wouldn't mind just typing a yes into the chat. If you can hear me, that would help so much. AI Southgate or Al Southgate, thank you so much. I'm glad that you're here. I appreciate the support and I'm glad that you saw my conversation with Patrick. Okay, so as far as I can tell, it looks like we do have sound. I'm just going to assume we've got sound. If something changes, if I start seeing people complain about no sound, then I will adjust. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, AI Southgate. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Okay, well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for being here. My name is Dylan Goos, and this is Existential Delight. And this is a little series I'm going to have here on the channel. I'm going to be working through G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, which is a book that I think the more people I can introduce this book to, the better. The more people that know about this book, the better. And for that reason, I'm going to do as much as I can on this channel to promote Chesterton and his writings. I was just actually recently today speaking to someone, and very well-read person, and they had never heard of Chesterton. And that just gave me more impetus to make this live stream today. So I'm going to be working through each chapter in Orthodoxy. Every single chapter is brilliant. I've often heard it said that reading Chesterton is like drinking champagne, that as you read him, the ideas sort of bubble off of the page. And for that reason, you can be hit by an idea left and right, and it can sometimes be overwhelming. You find yourself highlighting the entire book as you're reading it, because it's really one of the key writings in order to understand Chesterton. I would say you have to read Orthodoxy. I've read it twice, so I'm quite familiar with it, but every time I read it, I learn something new. And I'm sure that as I go through it now in these live readings, I'm going to learn even more new things. The first chapter isn't actually that long, but it sets up the foundation of the book. It actually begins it lays the foundation for what's to come. It explains why he decided to write Orthodoxy and what you can expect. And if you've never read Chesterton, I normally actually recommend people start with Orthodoxy before they go to something like The Everlasting Man, which is also an incredible book. So I am going to be reading through it, and I will give some commentary here and there, but where Chesterton speaks, I will do my best not to get in his way, because his ideas are just so brilliant, and they ring so true. And he really saw things as they are, and he could articulate that in a way that was witty, but he also never put other people down. He was very charitable in the way that he addressed his opponents, and that comes through right from the get-go. There's this certain joyous quality to his writing, which is really hard to describe, but once you read it, once I start reading it, you'll see what I mean. Okay, so let's have a look. Now, the first thing I should say is that Chesterton actually wrote Orthodoxy as a response to criticisms regarding his writings, heretics. So in Heretics, Chesterton basically criticizes a lot of modern philosophies, and then people subsequently criticized him for all this criticism, but you haven't really explained your philosophy to us yet. And so Orthodoxy is Chesterton's attempt not really to show you why you should believe in Christianity, but how he came to believe in Christianity. And of course, if you read how one person came to believe that something is true, there's a chance that in that process, you yourself will at some point start thinking the same way. Now, one interesting thing about Chesterton is his process of thought it's very enticing. He entices you out of your intense rationalism. He entices you out of your worldview in a way that you actually enjoy. So even very high-minded rationalists can appreciate Chesterton. And without further ado, let's jump into the first chapter. I'm actually going to start with the preface, and then we'll go into the first chapter. So Chesterton writes, "This book is meant to be a companion to heretics, and to put the positive side in addition to the negative. Many critics complained of the book called Heretics because it merely criticized current philosophies without offering any alternative philosophy. This book is an attempt to answer the challenge." So right from the get-go, right, we're, okay, wow, this is going to answer a challenge. Awesome. "It is unavoidably affirmative and therefore unavoidably autobiographical. The writer has been driven back upon somewhat the same difficulty as that which beset Newman in writing his Apologia. He has been forced to be egotistical only in order to be sincere." Right? "While everything else may be different, the motive in both cases is the same. It is the purpose of the writer to attempt an explanation, not of whether the Christian faith can be believed, but of how he personally has come to believe it. The book is therefore arranged upon the positive principle of a riddle and its answer. It deals first with all the writer's own solitary and sincere speculations, and then with all the startling style in which they were all suddenly satisfied by the Christian theology. The writer regards it as amounting to a convincing creed. But if it is not that, it is at least a repeated and surprising coincidence." I think another wonderful Chesterton quote, just while we're on that last line, "The more something seems to be a coincidence, the less it is a coincidence." Something Chesterton once said, "The more something seems to be a coincidence, the less it seems to be a coincidence." And I've often spoken to this with other people. Once you really start digging and you really start exploring the Christian worldview and the Christian claims, you begin to accumulate a set of arrows all pointing in one direction. And at some point, you have so many things directing you towards this inevitable point that it begins to seem suspicious, as if there's something going on that you didn't know about. And once that happens to you, your curiosity is so piqued that it begins to take more faith to believe that something is not going on. To simply dismiss everything as mere coincidence begins to seem more and more absurd, but more and more difficult to do as well. Okay, so that was just the preface, sort of highlighting that this is actually a companion to Heretics, which I'll probably also read at some stage. I don't see any reason not to. Obviously, with these readings, I get the chance to learn the ideas better, and I also get to promulgate them through my YouTube channel. So it's a win-win. Okay, so chapter 1 is actually an introduction, but it's also called In Defense of Everything Else. You know, Chesterton is often referred to as the apostle of common sense, right? And that really shines through in Orthodoxy. Okay, so he begins. "The only possible excuse for this book is that it is an answer to a challenge. Even a bad shot is dignified when he accepts a duel. When some time ago I published a series of hasty but sincere papers under the name of Heretics, several critics, for whose intellect I have a warm respect, I may mention specially Mr. G.S. Street, said that it was all very well for me to tell everybody to affirm his cosmic theory, but that I had carefully avoided supporting my precepts with example. Quote, "I will begin to worry about my philosophy," said Mr. Street, "when Mr. Chesterton has given us his." It was perhaps an incautious suggestion to make to a person only too ready to write books upon the feeblest provocation. That's one of my favorite lines in Orthodoxy. It was perhaps an incautious suggestion to make to a person only too ready to write books upon the feeblest provocation. Chesterton is so eager, so willing to wrestle and to expound upon and to extrapolate these ideas that just the smallest provocation, he's ready to write a whole book. And you really get that from his writing, right? The joy of writing, the joy of marshalling the words and marshalling the phrases to convey his ideas. He really took such pleasure in it, and I think it's one of the reasons why it's so fun to read him. Okay, so after that he says, just to recap, I'll read that one last time. It was perhaps an incautious suggestion to make to a person only too ready to write books upon the feeblest provocation, but after all, though Mr. Street has inspired and created this book, he need not read it. If he does read it, he will find that in its pages I have attempted in a vague and personal way, in a set of mental pictures, rather than in a series of deductions, to state the philosophy in which I have come to believe. I will not call it my philosophy, for I did not make it. God and humanity made it, and it made me. Beautiful. I have often had a fancy for writing a romance about an English yachtsman who slightly miscalculated his course and discovered England under the impression that it was a new island in the South Seas. I always find, however, that I am either too busy or too lazy to write this fine work, so I may as well give it away for the purposes of philosophical illustration. There will probably be a general impression that the man who landed, armed to the teeth and talking by signs, to plant the British flag on that barbaric temple which turned out to be the pavilion at Brighton, felt rather a fool. I am not here concerned to deny that he looked a fool, but if you imagine that he felt a fool, or at any rate that the sense of folly was his soul or his dominant emotion, then you have not studied with sufficient delicacy the rich romantic nature of the hero of this tale. His mistake was really a most enviable mistake, and he knew it, if he was the man I take him for. What could be more delightful than to have in the same few minutes all the fascinating terrors of going abroad, combined with all the humane security of coming home again? What could be better than to have all the fun of discovering South Africa without the disgusting necessity of landing there? What could be more glorious than to brace oneself up to discover New South Wales and then realize with a gush of happy tears that it was really Old South Wales? Chesterton really pokes fun at everyone, doesn't he? This at least seems to me the main problem for philosophers, and is in a manner the main problem of this book. And here Chesterton is going to ask some really, really interesting questions that you could think about these questions for the next 10 years, and they would still be fascinating. Wonderful questions. Listen to these. How can we contrive to be at once astonished at the world and yet at home in it? How can this queer cosmic town, this strange cosmic town, with its many-legged citizens, with its monstrous and ancient lamps, how can this world give us at once the fascination of a strange town, and yet the comfort and honor of being our own town? Right? There's this strange sensation about being here, about being alive, that we're at home, and yet we're not. We belong here, and yet we don't. We're in this world, and yet we're not of this world. Right? To show that a faith or a philosophy is true from every standpoint would be too big an undertaking, even for a much bigger book than this. It is necessary to follow one path of argument, and this is the path that I here propose to follow. I wish to set forth my faith as particularly answering this double spiritual need, the need for that mixture of the familiar and the unfamiliar, which Christendom has rightly named romance. romance, this mixture of what we know and what we don't know, of being in the world but not being of the world. Any one setting out to dispute anything Anyone setting out to dispute anything ought always to begin by saying that he does not dispute. Beyond stating what he proposes to prove, he should also state what he does not propose to prove. The thing I do not propose to prove, the thing I propose to take as common ground between myself and any average reader, is this desirability of an active and imaginative life, picturesque and full of a poetical curiosity, a life such as Western man at any rate always seems to have desired. If a man says that extinction is better than existence, or blank existence better than variety and adventure, then he is not one of the ordinary people to whom I am talking. If a man prefers nothing, I can give him nothing. But nearly all people I have ever met in this Western society in which I live would agree to the general proposition that we need this life of practical romance, the combination of something that is strange with something that is secure. We need so to view the world as to combine an idea of wonder and an idea of welcome. We need to be happy in this wonderland without once being merely comfortable. It is this achievement of my creed that I shall chiefly pursue in these pages. But I have a peculiar reason for mentioning the man in the yacht who discovered England. For I am that man in a yacht. I discovered England. I do not see how this book can avoid being egotistical, and I do not quite see, to tell the truth, how it can avoid being dull. Dullness will, however, free me from the charge which I most lament, the charge of being flippant. Mere light sophistry is the thing that I happen to despise most of all things, and it is perhaps a wholesome fact that this is the thing of which I am generally accused. I know nothing so contemptible as a mere paradox, a mere ingenious defense of the indefensible. If it were true, as has been said, that Mr. Bernard Shaw lived upon a paradox, then he ought to be a mere common millionaire, for a man of his mental activity could invent a sophistry every 6 minutes. It is as easy as lying, because it is lying. The truth is, of course, that Mr. Shaw is cruelly hampered by the fact that he cannot tell any lie unless he thinks it is the truth. I find myself under the same intolerable bondage. I never in my life said anything merely because I thought it funny, though of course I have had ordinary human vainglory, and may have thought it funny because I had said it. It is one thing to describe an interview with a gorgon or a griffin, a creature who does not exist. It is another thing to discover that the rhinoceros does exist, and then take pleasure in the fact that he looks as if he didn't. And on that line, I'd just like to pause, and just to say that one thing Chesterton, I would say one thing he tries to do, and I think successfully does, is he imbues a sense of wonder into the reader. There's a certain level of wonder, at the beginning of philosophy, asking questions about the world really stems from wonder. And Chesterton tries to show you the sheer wonder of just the sky, the sheer wonder of a brook, the sheer wonder of some birds in the sky, of birds flying across a valley. Things that we take so for granted. He tries to show you that the ordinary everyday things which seem so mundane are actually the most incredible things they are. And Alan Watts tried to do this a lot, and he actually quoted Chesterton, and he actually quoted this very quote in his attempt to do the same thing. Of course, I don't agree with Watts on many, many things, but one thing he got from Chesterton, just as I did, and just as many other people have, is this wonder of the ordinary. because it is precisely the ordinary which is so wonderful, right? And I'll just read that line again because it's so interesting to think about. He says, it's one thing to describe like imagine seeing a gorgon or a griffin, these incredible creatures that don't exist, right? But and that's one thing to be amazed at this thing that doesn't exist. But then think about a rhinoceros or a giraffe, which is something that looks like it shouldn't exist, but it does. And it's in that moment that you begin to understand what Chesterton is trying to convey in terms of wonder. This wonder at things that look as if they shouldn't exist, and yet they do. We have to have wonder. We have to have wonder at the world. Just the sheer wonder of opening your eyes is, I have a song on my channel which I wrote. It's called Obvious. And the main line of the song, which is kind of the line that I wrote and that inspired me to write the rest of the song, the main line is, we're blinded by the obvious. And the idea is that the things that seem the most obvious to us blind us because we don't really see them, right? We're looking, but we don't see. And without going into too much of a tangent, Chesterton breaks through that. Okay, so let's continue. He then says, it is another thing to discover that the rhinoceros does not exist and then take pleasure in the fact that it looks as if he didn't. One searches for truth, but it may be that one pursues instinctively the more extraordinary truths. And I offer this book with the heartiest sentiments to all the jolly people who hate what I write, and regard it, very justly for all I know, as a piece of poor clowning or a single tiresome joke. Okay. For if this book is a joke, it is a joke against me. I am the man who with the utmost daring discovered what had been discovered before. If there is an element of farce in what follows, the farce is at my own expense. For this book explains how I fancied I was the first to set foot in Brighton, and then found I was the last. It recounts my elephantine adventures in pursuit of the obvious. No one can think my case more ludicrous than I think it myself. No reader can accuse me here of trying to make a fool of him. I am the fool of the story, and no rebel shall hurl me from my throne. I freely confess all the idiotic ambitions of the end of the 19th century. I did, like all other solemn little boys, try to be in advance of the age. Like them, I tried to be some 10 minutes in advance of the truth, and I found that I was 1800 years behind it. I did strain my voice with a painfully juvenile exaggeration in uttering my truths, and I was punished in the fittest and funniest way. For I have kept my truths, but I have discovered not that they were not truths, but simply that they were not mine. When I fancied that I stood alone, I was really in the ridiculous position of being backed up by all of Christendom. It may be, heaven forgive me, that I did try to be original, but I only succeeded in inventing all by myself an inferior copy of the existing traditions of civilized religion. The man from the yacht thought he was the first to find England. I thought I was the first to find Europe. I did try to found a heresy of my own, and when I had put the last touches to it, I discovered that it was Orthodoxy. It may be that somebody will be entertained by the account of this happy fiasco. It might amuse a friend or an enemy to read how I gradually learned from the truth of some stray legend or from the falsehood of some dominant philosophy, things that I might have learned from my catechism, if I had ever learnt it. There may or may not be some entertainment in reading how I found at last in an anarchist club or a Babylonian temple what I might have found in the nearest parish church. If anyone is entertained by learning how the flowers of the field, or the phrases in an omnibus, the accidents of politics or the pains of youth came together in a certain order to produce a certain conviction of Christian orthodoxy, he may possibly read this book. But there is in everything a reasonable division of labor. I have written the book, and nothing on earth would induce me to read it. I add one purely pedantic note which comes as a note naturally should, at the beginning of the book. These essays are concerned only to discuss the actual fact that the central Christian theology, sufficiently summarized in the Apostles' Creed, is the best root of energy and sound ethics. They are not intended to discuss the very fascinating but quite different question of what is the present seat of authority for the proclamation of that creed. When the word orthodoxy is used here, it means the Apostles' Creed, as understood by everybody calling himself Christian until a very short time ago, and the general historic conduct of those who held such a creed. I have been forced by mere space to confine myself to what I have got from this creed. I do not touch the matter much disputed among modern Christians of where we ourselves got it. This is not an ecclesiastical treatise, but a sort of slovenly autobiography. But if anyone wants my opinions about the actual nature of the authority, Mr. G.S. Street has only to throw me another challenge, and I will write him another book. Okay, so beautiful dramatic exit. Chesterton always had the dramatic exit, right? So, you're in the world, you're trying to understand reality, you're trying to understand the world you see around you, you're trying to understand the evil you see in the world, you're trying to understand the suffering you see in the world, you're trying to understand the nature of humans and why we do the things we do. And you're sort of setting sail, just metaphorically speaking, trying to come to terms with all these questions you have. You're setting sail off to a distant land. And as you try to find out these answers, you come to certain conclusions. But eventually you realize, and this is what Chesterton realized, that the conclusions he had reached in terms of evil in the world, the nature of humans, life and death, the reality of the soul, he realized that the conclusions he had come to were sort of poor copies of what Christian theology had already summarized and proclaimed 1800 years prior, right? 800 years before him. And so he uses this beautiful analogy where he thinks he's landed in a new land that he's discovered, right? He's figured out this new philosophy. But he's actually walking where he always was, and the ideas surrounding him were already correct, but he didn't realize it. And so he ends up putting the final touches on his own system, only to realize that that system is orthodoxy, as summed up by the Apostles' Creed. Okay, so that's just the first chapter, and it's not a long chapter, mind you. It's a pretty quick one. Chapter 2 is the maniac. That's a little bit more in depth. Chesterton talks a little bit about the lunacy of straight reason and just complete rationalism, and he talks about the role of the imagination. That's going to be really interesting. I'm really excited for chapter 2. Chapter 4 is the one I'm really looking forward to. Chapter 4 is called The Ethics of Elfland. And in a single chapter, Chesterton is going to show you why fairy tales are so valuable. And he's going to change the way you think about fairy tales. And he's even going to talk a little bit about some pretty heavy philosophy in terms of inductive reasoning. We're going to get into that in chapter 4. Orthodoxy is a masterpiece. And Chesterton, man, I can't really say enough, but Chesterton changes the way you see the world through this book. And even if you are already a believer, he will definitely leave a positive impact on your faith through this book. So I'm so glad you guys could all be here to listen to me. To me, it's kind of bizarre that people would just listen to a guy read and maybe give a little bit of commentary. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. I'm just going to have a quick look at the comments and just I guess, comment on the comments. And then we're going to wrap things up. I will see you not too long from now. I will do chapter 2. I won't do it today. I'll do it in the near future. And like I said, I'm going to go through every single chapter. So if you do enjoy the way I read or the style I read, please consider tuning in for those. They'll also be live. And if you enjoyed this, please consider clicking that like button. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing. It does help the channel. And yeah, so having a quick look at the comments, Al Southgate says, found you through David Patrick Harry. Awesome. I really enjoyed the chat with Patrick. He's a really cool guy. We're definitely going to talk again in the future. And then Ross Whitlock says, can you turn yourself up a little? Okay, I did that already. And then Beast Invader, my second Bible, Orthodoxy, my second Bible, read it 6 times. Wow, man, that's awesome. That's definitely more than I have. It is the kind of book I feel like you could read Orthodoxy 20 times and you'd still have more to learn, right? It's such a great read. If you're too curious to wait for me to read it, I really encourage you to consider getting it. And then after you've read Orthodoxy, you definitely want to read Everlasting Man. And then consider, if you're interested in fiction, Chesterton's Father Brown series is also really good. Okay, so thank you so much for watching, ladies and gentlemen. And this is Existential Light. My name is Dylan Goos, and I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, please consider subscribing, consider clicking a like. I've got more and more content coming out, and I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day or night wherever you are on the planet, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.